Chosen one, you have moved with a level of strategic precision that has left your opposition completely blindsided. They were not prepared for what you just did, and now they're questioning everything they thought they knew about your limits. They are now forced to reckon with the fact that their certainty was actually a profound delusion. Every power struggle has a defining moment that people miss in real time. It is not a confrontation, it is not a public declaration. It is a quiet internal decision made by someone who believes they have the authority to determine your worth. They looked at you, they weighed you against the narrow mental framework they apply to everyone, and they drew a conclusion: safe, predictable, no real threat. They assigned you a ceiling before you had even shown them what you were building toward, and once that conclusion was filed, they stopped questioning it entirely. Every strategy they developed from that moment forward, every counter-move they prepared, every protective measure they put in place, was constructed on top of that one wrong assessment. That one wrong decision became the load-bearing wall of everything they built after it. And a load-bearing wall is only as strong as the foundation beneath it. The foundation was already cracked. Meanwhile, you were operating. You were acquiring understanding they were not tracking. You were building capacity they were not measuring. You were developing in directions they were not watching, because they had already decided they knew your limits. Their certainty about you became your protection. Their dismissal became your freedom. Every single day they spent comfortable in their false conclusion was another day you spent becoming more than what they believed you were capable of being. The distance between who they thought you were and who you were actually becoming kept widening. They had no idea that distance existed. They thought the gap between your starting point and your ceiling was short enough to see all at once. What they refused to know, because knowing would have cost them something they were not willing to pay, is that your ceiling was never where they drew it. It existed somewhere they had not thought to look. That is where this begins, their one fatal mistake, made confidently and filed away permanently. Everything that follows is the consequence of that mistake finally arriving. You understood something that most people spend their entire lives never figuring out. Noise is expensive. Premature announcement is a strategic liability. Every time you declare your intentions before the outcome is secured, you hand your opposition a set of coordinates. You let them see your trajectory. You allow them to position, to counter, and to introduce friction into something that is not yet strong enough to survive interference. You did not do that. You stayed quiet. Not because you doubted yourself. That is the version they invented, the comfortable explanation where your silence was really fear in disguise. Your silence was not fear. Your silence was precision. It was the understanding held at a deep and instinctive level that some things must be developed in the dark before they are strong enough to withstand the light. While they were monitoring the surface, watching for obvious moves, public declarations, the kind of visible conflict they were trained to track and respond to, you were doing something they had no category for. You were letting the work change you from the inside. You were not performing preparation or going through the motions of readiness. You were being genuinely transformed by immersion in something real. You were absorbing not just information but deep understanding, the kind of understanding that cannot be summarized in a meeting, that lives in instinct, and that only belongs to someone who went far enough into something to know exactly where the real leverage is. They skimmed the surface of what mattered. You went all the way to the bottom. That difference is what they could not measure, and therefore could not account for. When the moment of action finally arrived, you did not have to calculate on the spot. You did not have to consult anyone. You did not have to wait for external confirmation of something you already knew from the inside. You moved from genuine understanding. You moved from a place that was absolutely real. Movement that originates from that kind of depth has a quality that cannot be manufactured, cannot be rushed, and cannot be replicated by someone who spent the equivalent period merely performing the appearance of preparation. They were ready for the version of you that needed permission to proceed. They were prepared for the version that second-guessed, delayed, and looked for external validation before committing to anything decisive. What showed up instead was someone who had already navigated every objection internally, already stress-tested every assumption in private, and arrived at the moment of action with a clarity that looked like confidence from the outside, but was actually something rarer and more durable. It was readiness, the real kind, the kind that comes from genuine depth, not the performance of it. They fortified positions you had already decided not to occupy. They built defenses against moves you had already decided not to make. Their entire protective apparatus was aimed at a version of you that no longer existed, a version that operated within the boundaries they controlled. And while they were busy protecting against the predictable, you had quietly relocated to territory they had never thought to monitor. If these words stirred your consciousness, hype this video to help more chosen ones awaken to this. Here is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. While you were building something real in the quiet, the people around you were performing. There is a fundamental difference between those two activities, and most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding that distinction. Consider what the performance looked like from the outside. Full schedules, long working periods, projects that were always in motion and always almost complete, always on the verge of something significant. The busyness itself was worn as evidence of commitment and seriousness. The performance was convincing because activity and genuine progress look identical when nobody is checking outcomes closely enough. But they are not identical, they are not even in the same category. Motion without direction is not progress. It is stalling dressed in the clothing of effort. It is the art of remaining exactly where you are while appearing to move somewhere meaningful. And the people you outpaced had refined that art over a long period of time. Their effort was fundamentally safe. Safe effort is the favorite refuge of people who are genuinely afraid of what real commitment exposes. When you are always in process, always preparing, always refining, always nearly ready, you cannot fail in the way that produces the unbearable public exposure they were most determined to avoid. You can always point to the work in progress. You can always attribute the lack of arrival to circumstances outside your control. The process itself becomes a permanent shield against the moment of measurement. Then you arrived with a completed result. It was clean, decisive, and undeniable. It was not a project in progress or a concept in development. It was an outcome that stood entirely on its own. The contrast between your one decisive move and their extended period of protected motion was suddenly and unavoidably visible to everyone present. You did not just outperform them, you exposed what their performance actually was. You pulled back the curtain and showed everyone present that nothing behind it was generating real output. That exposure is not simply embarrassing, it is identity shattering. Their identity was constructed entirely around their process. When you proved the process was decoration, you did not just challenge their strategy, you challenged the entire identity they had built around it. Here is the deeper wound beneath that. They had been confusing movement with momentum, and those are not the same thing. Movement is activity. Momentum is accumulated force, aimed at something specific and real. You can move indefinitely, in loops in familiar territory, in comfortable circles, and produce zero momentum. Momentum requires direction. It requires genuine commitment to a defined outcome. It requires the willingness to be measured against that outcome when the time comes. They were never willing to be measured. Every meeting that resolved into another meeting, every decision that required more consultation before it could be made, all of it was protection against the moment when a real result would be demanded, because results can fall short, and falling short in front of witnesses was the thing they were most determined to prevent. You chose differently. You chose to be measured. You accepted the exposure that genuine commitment requires, and in making that choice, you produced the undeniable outcome that their prolonged avoidance of measurement could never achieve. Now they are being measured against you without having chosen to be. They spent a long time avoiding measurement, and then your result made comparison inevitable anyway. Look, you already know the attacks weren't random, and if you're paying attention, you can feel it. Their walls are closing in. You've also noticed something else, A lot of chosen one channels on YouTube have gone quiet, videos removed, voices pushed off the platform. The mainstream media is cracking down on us, but we will not give up our voice. So let's talk about what we're doing about it. That's why I built Destiny Engine, and when you join, you're not just supporting your favorite channels, you're also fueling your own rise. It's a 360 win. It generates personalized sequences that help you rewire betrayal into transcendence, turn isolation into sacred power, and transform their downfall into your rise. We are using the Dark Elite's own weapons against them, taking their declassified consciousness technology that programmed competition and scarcity and repurposing it to serve cooperative intelligence. The beauty is you don't even have to lift a finger. You put on the headphones, press play, and your subconscious is rewired while your enemies collapse under the weight of their own lies. This is why I created it in the beginning, so everything they did to break you becomes fuel for your purpose. The collective upgrade is underway. Start your Destiny Engine for $7 today and watch divine justice accelerate in your life. Link in the description. They had a narrative prepared. They always do. And this particular narrative had served them well for a long time. The private version of it went like this. Whatever you accomplished came equipped with an asterisk, a hidden advantage, a fortunate break, some form of external assistance that you did not quite earn on your own merit. This was never something they announced out loud. It lived as the background interpretation that activated whenever your name came up. It was the framing that protected them from feeling the full weight of what your forward movement actually meant about their own choices. For a long time, enough ambiguity existed to keep the narrative functional. Results can be spun, circumstances can be cited, the interpretation held. Then you did something they could not spin. You delivered a result so clearly rooted in real skill, so visibly the product of disciplined preparation and earned execution, so precisely timed by someone who had been paying careful attention while others looked elsewhere, that the excuse machinery simply seized. There was no gap in the evidence to exploit, no convenient ambiguity to stretch, and no circumstance to gesture toward. The result was too clean, and clean results have a specific effect. They strip every hiding place bare simultaneously. The question they had been successfully avoiding now had nowhere left to go. If your outcome was pure merit, undiluted, undeniable merit, then what explains the distance between where you are and where they are? Not fortune, not circumstance, not invisible assistance. What explains it is will, focus, and consistency, the choices made in private, in the spaces where no one was watching and no credit was being offered. There is something particularly decisive about standing fully in your own light and simply letting the physics of contrast operate. You did not aim anything at them. A strong light always produces a shadow. Every shadow in their personal history is now sharply visible. Here is what permanently closes the door on any replacement narrative. Your result arrived publicly, in front of people who know both you and them, in a context where comparison was not only possible, but structurally unavoidable. The excuse functions in isolation. It works when you are the only audience for it. But once witnesses exist, once real people have seen an undeniable outcome, sustaining the old interpretation requires deceiving an entire informed audience. That is a problem with no simple solution. They are not only losing the excuse, they are losing the conditions that made the excuse operational in the first place. Without those conditions, what remains is an exposure that no new framing will fully cover. Some people build their entire identity around controlling access. They decide who is ready. They determine who is worthy. They position themselves as the necessary intermediary between you and the opportunities, recognition, and resources that matter. This authority is presented as expertise, and it feels to the people subject to it like the natural order of things. It functions exactly as designed, as long as the people standing outside believe the gate in front of them is the only way through. Your belief in their gate was the mechanism of their control. Every time you oriented toward their approval, you confirmed their authority. Every time you positioned yourself within the framework they maintained, you reinforced the idea that their framework was the only one with any legitimacy. Their power was never actually in the gate itself. It was in your acceptance of the premise that no entrance existed without their involvement. You stopped accepting that premise, not with confrontation and not with a public declaration. You turned in a different direction entirely and built something they had not created and could not claim. You built a platform that did not require their infrastructure. You cultivated an audience that did not need their endorsement. You generated leverage that originated from your own results rather than their approval. You located, or more precisely, you constructed an entrance they had never anticipated because they were certain it did not exist. When your outcome arrived through a door they did not build, something structural collapsed in the narrative they had been maintaining about their own authority. Gatekeeping is not genuine authority, it is performed authority. And performed authority loses all power the moment the people subject to it stop believing in it. They could not discredit what you built without exposing the bitterness that would immediately disqualify their assessment. They could not claim credit for your result without the dishonesty being obvious to every witness present. All they could do was watch. And watching someone prove that their gate was never the only entrance is the specific kind of revelation that permanently changes how that person is perceived by others and, most painfully, by themselves. When you arrived through your own entrance with a result in hand, you made the bypass visible to everyone observing. You transformed it from a theoretical possibility, the kind of thing people whisper about but nobody has actually demonstrated, into a documented reality. Every person who had been waiting at the gate, positioning carefully, hoping to earn the approval they had been told was required, witnessed what you did. Each one of them is now running a private recalculation. The gatekeeper can feel that shift. Not in any single event they can identify directly, but in the texture of interactions that now require more maintenance than they used to. Authority that requires that much effort to sustain was never absolute, it was performance, and now the performance is working harder than it ever had to before. Pull back and consider the larger picture. The most destabilizing effect of your move was not proving them wrong about one specific thing. It was detonating the question they cannot stop asking. If they were wrong about you, someone they observed closely, assessed carefully, and felt completely certain about, what else have they been wrong about? That question does not have a comfortable destination. It starts with you, but it does not stop there. It moves through every confident conclusion they have been operating on, every person they have categorized, every system they have trusted, and every rule they have treated as settled. The credibility of their own perception, the instrument they depend on most, is now under audit. What makes this genuinely unbearable is the location of the error. You did not create the distorted picture they were carrying. You simply lived in your full capacity until the picture became impossible to maintain. The manufactured version of you that kept them comfortable was their construction, not yours. It was assembled from wishful assumption, selective attention, and the very human preference for certainty over accuracy. They chose to inhabit it. They actively maintained it by looking away from evidence that contradicted it. When it collapsed, the deception they discovered was not something done to them from outside. It was something generated from within their own perceptual framework. That is why they cannot direct clean anger at you. The source of the error lives in their own reflection. Facing an error that originated inside yourself is a fundamentally different and far more difficult confrontation than facing one that arrived from outside. What you have put them through is not simply a revision of their assessment of you. It is a full audit of their judgment as a navigational instrument. Audits of that depth do not conclude quickly or cleanly. Every assumption they carry now comes with a question mark attached. Every confident position they take carries an unwelcome new possibility that they are once again wrong in a way they cannot currently see. You did not do this to them deliberately. You simply became fully yourself, and full self-expression, when it has been genuinely earned through depth of preparation and disciplined execution, makes surrounding performances visibly hollow by comparison. You held up a surface, the reflection in it was theirs, and they cannot unsee what they saw. This is the moment everything was building toward. Every element we have examined, your strategic silence, their false certainty, the accumulating gap between what they believed and what was actually developing, the authority they performed without a genuine foundation, all of it converged at a single point. This is where the lightning struck. You moved. You did not move gradually or with advance notice. You did not move along the trajectory they had been monitoring or in the direction they had prepared to counter. You moved the way that only someone with genuine depth of preparation can move, with precision, with a speed that appeared sudden from the outside because the entire period of preparation behind it had been invisible, and with absolute clarity about exactly what the moment required. That clarity belonged to someone who had been paying close attention long after everyone else had stopped. The outcome was irreversible before the people who might have interfered understood what was happening. That is the defining characteristic of a truly decisive move. It does not simply succeed, it completes before the window for disruption opens. By the time they recognized what had occurred, history had already been written, and history does not negotiate revisions. Consider what that finality meant for every strategic position they held. Their prepared counters had no move to respond to. Their defended positions were not the positions you occupied. The ceiling they had drawn for you existed in a space you had already departed. Every element of the apparatus they had constructed to contain and manage you was aimed at a version of you that had quietly moved beyond its reach. They anticipated a direct challenge. You arrived as a builder, and builders do not compete for existing structures. They construct new ones that make the old ones irrelevant. When the version of you they had invented finally shattered against the reality of who you actually are, the experience was not simply surprise, it was cognitive collapse. Two completely incompatible realities, the one they had built their entire approach around, and the one your result made undeniable, could not occupy the same space simultaneously. Only one could survive the collision. They already know which one it was, and they will be processing that knowledge for a very long time. There was a threat they kept available as leverage, the suggestion that you were interchangeable, that your absence or departure would be absorbed smoothly, the operation adjusted, and everything continued without meaningful disruption. This belief was not only a threat, it was foundational to the sense of power they maintained over you. Dispensable people are controllable people. They needed you to feel dispensable. When you made your move, something they did not anticipate began happening. The results started producing evidence they could not argue away. Without you operating inside the dynamic in the same way, gaps appeared. Not theoretical gaps, but real ones, visible in real outcomes, in real moments where things that used to run smoothly began stuttering. They deployed adjustments, they pointed to ongoing activity and described it as stability. But results are honest in ways that the people generating them sometimes are not, and the results kept pointing back to the same absence. Here is what they fundamentally misunderstood about your value, and what you should clearly understand about yourself going forward. The rarest kind of contribution is not isolated skill. Skill can be sourced. It is not knowledge alone. Knowledge can be acquired. What cannot be replicated is the specific convergence of how you think, how you perceive opportunity, how you time decisions, how you execute under pressure, and what you bring from everything you have specifically experienced and survived. That convergence was grown in particular conditions, over a particular period, through particular circumstances. It cannot be approximated by locating someone with a comparable background. The presence your departure left behind had a shape that nothing else could fill. You no longer need to carry the false weight of believing that your position is fragile or that your absence would be seamlessly absorbed. That belief was always a tool being used against you. Your move dissolved it permanently. The evidence is in the outcomes, and outcomes speak at a volume that no counter-narrative can match. There was a resource gap, a real and substantial one. The advantages arrayed on the other side were not imaginary. The established connections, the accumulated capital, the access to influence that opens doors before you even identify them. By every conventional measurement of who is positioned to win, the material advantages were not in your favor, and then you applied vision to the situation. Vision, properly understood, is not a soft or secondary advantage. It is the commanding advantage. Resources without vision are raw material without a design. You can accumulate unlimited material and still produce nothing of value without someone who can see before anything is built exactly what the finished structure needs to look like and precisely how each element connects to produce it. They had material, you had design. That asymmetry produced an outcome that continues to confuse them because it does not fit the model they were using to predict results. The specific effect that baffled them most was directional multiplication. Every resource you touched was amplified because it was deployed with intention. Every period of effort returned disproportionate results because it was aimed at something specific. Every decision you made reinforced the ones before it because they were all oriented toward the same defined outcome. The resources available to you were fewer, and the returns they generated were greater because direction applied consistently turns limited resources into compounding assets. Their abundant resources scattered across unconverging priorities and returned fractions of their potential. They generated volume, you generated impact, and impact, accumulated with direction over time, is the most formidable force in any competitive environment. You cannot be outthought by being outspent. The arena you are building in rewards depth of understanding over quantity of resources. You shifted the measure of what power actually means. It is no longer about who possesses the most. It is about who extracts the most from what they have. And in that true measurement, the only one that has ever actually mattered, you have already established your position clearly. Consider the people who were present but not fully aligned. The ones who performed agreement without fully believing in what they were agreeing to. The ones who maintained surface-level loyalty while privately remaining undecided about whether what they were witnessing was actually worth following. These people were watching you more carefully than anyone acknowledged. They were not just observing what you were doing, but studying how you were doing it, the quality of your decision-making, the consistency between what you said and what you produced, the willingness you demonstrated to move without requiring external permission or validation. They were registering all of it, long before your decisive move, and running private assessments that were never discussed out loud. When you made your move focused, outcome-oriented, undeniable in its results, something shifted in those private assessments. The shift was not public, it was internal, in the places where actual opinions are maintained rather than performed, and the internal verdict moved in your direction, not because you asked for it, not because you campaigned or positioned yourself as an alternative, but because you produced something real. And real things, in environments full of performed things, attract genuine attention that cannot be manufactured or bought. The people who observed your move are now paying attention to you in a way they were not before. That attention is not born from obligation or social positioning. It is born from genuine interest in what you will do next. That is a specific quality of attention that belongs only to those who have earned it through demonstrated results. The foundation of the authority being performed on the other side depended on the assumption that the people around it were fully committed. Fully committed audiences do not quietly reassess their position. Fully committed audiences do not run private calculations about whether their alignment is well placed. The moment private reassessment begins, the moment even a portion of the people present start quietly asking whether they are positioned correctly, the authority being performed must work harder to maintain what it used to hold effortlessly. And authority that requires that level of effort to sustain was never the absolute command it was presented as being. The deepest consequence of what you did is not what it proved about you. It is what your proof forces every other person who witnessed it to see about themselves. When you stepped forward with decisive, demonstrated, outcome-backed clarity, you did not simply create a contrast, you created an involuntary inventory for every person observing. The comparison arrived the way undeniable things always arrive, not as an invitation, but as an unavoidable confrontation. And for everyone who has been choosing safety over genuine commitment, choosing the appearance of progress over actual results, or choosing to protect themselves from exposure over pursuing the outcome that would require it, that inventory is painful in a specific and lasting way. They cannot dismiss your result as circumstance. The precision behind what you did removes that option. They cannot attribute it to fortune. The consistency of the preparation underlying it is too visible. They cannot argue that your conditions were more favorable because you built from comparable circumstances with less available support and produced more. The single variable that explains the different outcome is the one they most need to avoid naming. You chose to move when movement was difficult, and they chose to wait for conditions that would never arrive. Every future decision they make will carry the shadow of that awareness. Every time they find themselves stalling, delaying, or retreating into the protection of ongoing preparation, your outcome will surface as unwanted evidence of what a different choice looks like, not as accusation. You have said nothing and need say nothing. It stands as permanent, living proof that what they kept telling themselves was not yet possible was in fact possible all along. You removed the last plausible excuse. That is the wound that does not close quickly, not that someone surpassed them, but that someone demonstrated what genuine commitment to an outcome actually produces. That demonstration cannot be undone. The distance between what they now know is possible and what they have been willing to attempt is entirely theirs to sit with. It is the private reckoning that your public result made inevitable. The assessors who decided your ceiling without your input have been permanently corrected by evidence they cannot dispute. The narrative that surrounded your success with asterisks has been stripped of every qualifying condition it relied on. The authority that positioned itself as the necessary gateway between you and what you were building has been revealed as conditional on your cooperation, and your cooperation has been withdrawn. The claim that you were interchangeable has been answered by outcomes that only occurred under the specific conditions your presence created. The accumulated resources that were supposed to make the opposing position unassailable were outperformed by your direction and your vision. The audience that was presented as fully committed has been quietly and permanently recalibrated. Every element of the position held over you was constructed on the assumption that you would remain within the boundaries they had drawn. The moment you stepped beyond those boundaries, not with announcement, not with confrontation, but simply by building something real in the territory they were not watching, the entire construction began losing structural integrity. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the inevitable consequence of a foundation that was never as solid as it had been presented. The quiet at the beginning was not emptiness. It was pressure accumulating. It was architecture advancing. It was the work of someone who understood at a fundamental level that the right moment is not the comfortable moment. The right moment is the irreversible one, the one where by the time anyone who might have interfered recognizes what is happening, it is already beyond interference. That is the moment you waited for. That is the moment you created. That is the moment you delivered. And now it cannot be undone. Your name is permanently attached to this outcome. History does not issue revisions for the benefit of people who were caught unprepared. What you produced exists as standing testimony to exactly who you are and exactly what becomes possible when a chosen one decides to fully occupy their actual capacity rather than the limited version others mapped out for them. No narrative constructed in opposition can compete with that testimony. Results at this level are their own argument, and they make that argument every time simply by existing. They were not prepared for what you just did because genuine preparation requires accurate understanding of what is coming. They never accurately understood you. Their entire apparatus was constructed against a smaller, more convenient version of you that existed only in their willingness to believe it. The real version, the one that was quietly building, studying and waiting for the precise moment, was always operating outside the range of their planning. This is not an ending, this is the axis point. It is the moment where the direction of everything reverses, where the person who has been the object of other people's assessments becomes the subject of their own unfolding. It is where patience that looked like waiting reveals itself as strategy that was always active. The scariest disruption is the one no one saw approaching. They did not see this one. And now they are standing in the aftermath, looking at the evidence of what happened, understanding for the first time and permanently that they were never dealing with who they believed they were dealing with. Every element of this that looked like endurance from the outside was strategy from the inside. The patience was intentional, the silence was protective, the preparation was specific, the timing was precise, none of it was passive, all of it was chosen. They were not ready for you then, they are not ready for you now. And chosen one, the essential thing to carry forward from this, they will not be ready for you again. The measure of power has changed, the landscape has been permanently recalibrated, and the person who triggered the entire reckoning without raising a voice, without asking for permission, without waiting for a credential from people who were never qualified to grant it, that is you, that has always been you. And now at last there is no version of events in which anyone present can pretend otherwise. God's hand was always on this. The outcome was never uncertain, only the timing was, and the timing was always exactly